This is a part 2 of the podcast introducing the Swedish Royal Academy of War Sciences and its SES project on security in tomorrow's world for Sweden and Europe. We will now start again the discussion between myself and Mikael Sahlin, the chair of Section 6 of the Academy, responsible for the security policy part of the project. And we were in the previous podcast outlining the 4 dimensions of the project, starting with the southern dimension, moving on to the eastern, then to the western, and finally to the northern part. On the southern dimension, we will in this podcast focus on the already presented report on the Middle East by the Academy, and then move on to the report, outline of the report, which we are planning for the end of 2019 on the entire southern dimension. The interesting thing here is that we are putting questions that were probably regarded as rather academic or Eurocentric only a couple of years ago. People were saying, well, Europe is not the main issue here, it is a transatlantic issue, which is a key, it's NATO, which is key, it's military, which is key, and we are focusing on the need for having the strong sort of transatlantic link as a basic assumption for everything we do. And now we are of course faced with fundamental changes which put into question, at least temporarily, the validity of some of the assumptions that have been made, both as regards the unity of the European continent with Brexit and the predictability of our relationship with the United States. So now there is a new, also from realists, so to say, a new question mark about should we possibly upgrade our attention to what can be done in Europe, not necessarily by the EU, but some sort of different types of coalitions on the European level, which can help to tackle questions which are bigger than those that can be tackled by individual countries. Maybe I should just mention there that we are talking about huge potential problems for the future. Mentioning in the southern dimension, Africa, for instance, where we have an enormous opportunity to see a wonderful development, but we have also enormous challenges. We have environmental challenges, climate challenges, we have a demography with a doubled population in Africa. We have an increasing poverty, despite the positive changes that, for instance, Rosling has used to put the attention to. Still, the statistics tell us that there are more poor people in Africa now than was the case a couple of decades ago. We have a competition about strategic resources. We have, as a result of that, a pressure in terms of migration. We have the Islamization issue, we have terrorism and other things that we need to tackle. And all these questions are basically too big for any single country to deal with.
The Academy and this project now, of course, is something that aims for something that is useful, also concretely useful for Swedish authorities and others. So it's not just an academic exercise in that sense. And therefore, we tried to do in parallel a two-track thing initially, which was to have a symposium in the fall about trends in European security in a sort of Brexit or post-Brexit perspective with an international panel. And then we proceeded to a track which we chose also in view of what was possible to do in time to be usefully transmitted to the Defense Commission of Sweden, which was doing its security policy work. So we started out with the study of the Middle East and spillover risks from the Middle East to Europe. The basic idea in that study, which is now published, being that there is a discrepancy between the way and the extent to which Europe is affected by all those crises spilling over from the Middle East, and on the other hand, limited abilities to do much about those risks because of a certain amount of political and diplomatic and military impotence on the part of the EU, in spite of the Middle East being our near abroad. So we focused on that dilemma, and then it became natural for us to conceive as next steps to have the EU look now to the south, and then to the east, and then to the west, so to speak, because everything belongs and everything is basic to what the EU is and what major European countries feel that they are in relation to the various challenges that are typical of our day. And this relates to not decades of years, but the next few years of uncertainty, unusual amount of uncertainty. So that's what we're planning to do.
I mean, this is something that we used to discuss when we joined the EU in the mid-90s, that we need to focus, upgrade our attention and our knowledge about the Mediterranean dimension and the southern dimension, the southern neighborhood, and also in selfish terms, in order for the people in the south to be interested in the northern dimension and devote resources to that in the EU, we need to show solidarity with them. And now we have, as was clearly stated in the report of the Defense Commission recently, we do have a legal requirement to show solidarity in order to both give and to receive support also in military terms. So it's a new ball game for Sweden. We are in that sense in a part of a bigger community, which we can, of course, say that, well, it's too big. We need to devote our attention to our own situation. But in reality, as Tony Blair and others have said recently, that is, in the future we will have China, we will have United States, we will have India, we will have Brazil, we have Indonesia, etc., etc., and all of these, Nigeria, we will have countries which are enormously important on the world map. And he didn't even mention Russia in that list. And the Chinese are moving ahead at a speed which is breathtaking for even the Americans today. So how can Europe deal with this?
And all this affects Sweden concretely, because we are part of this same Europe, sharing the same basic challenges as Europe does. Can I add to your history this thought that we first had the Cold War conditions, and then we had the 90s and the early 2000s with the trend towards looking at the world as basically safe and sound, and the big issue was peace operations and cooperation, crisis management. And then came the cold shock of security returning, as we said before. And then it was all about Russia and about transatlantic links in response to that. And now, again, we have a trend which compels us as Sweden and as EU and as Europe to consider the fact that in order for there to be basic unity within the EU and Europe, we must reconcile that there are different interests, different trends that have to be coordinated, because we are equally faced by the various challenges, and the direction south is an enormously important aspect, which also Sweden has to relate to, because many of our partners in the EU primarily look at the challenges from that direction in terms of concrete policy making.
I mean, most people in Sweden, they are aware that Russia is enormous in size. A territorial dimension of Russia is enormous, including Siberia and so on. But what people are not aware of, to the same extent, I think, is the fact that when we look to the south, we're looking at the coastal distance from, let's say, from Cairo to Senegal, close to the Canary Islands, of 7,500 kilometers. A coastline of 7,500 kilometers, and even further if you go up to Turkey and with the migration problems there. And we have a surface of the African continent which is some 150 times the surface of Syria. So you can only imagine if you would have any level of difficulties on the, comparable what we've seen in the Gaza Strip or in Syria or in Iraq and so on, distributed over wide parts of Africa, where we already now have difficult situations, implosion in Libya, Central African Republic, etc., etc. We really have to look up here and see what can we do to prevent such a nightmare it would be if we have implosion along this entire coastline.
Can I add here that it's not just a question of Swedish solidarity, it is also Sweden concretely being affected by the pressures from the south, including and the question of migration is going to have a massive influence. Other things too, but migration with the great potential, not just from Syria but from all of the southern borders. And then still, you and I haven't mentioned climate, but this is an added aspect which makes really an impact, both an impact on Europe but also compelling Europe to act in unison, because that too is too large a thing to handle by individual countries. And climate, migration, terror, it is enormously challenging, and as such a reason why European unison and cooperation is so important. That's the best thing we have to deal with those things.
And the key phrase here, I suppose, is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I mean, we have so many mistakes that have been made, so many. I've listened to so many former chiefs of defense, both in the UK and France, and to a certain extent in Germany, have told me, we didn't have a concept for our operations. We did things without seeing the full picture. The Libya operation was not well thought through because there was no follow-on to what was done on the military level. We have had no sustainability in our work, military operations in Congo, for instance, in the last decade. So, and Mali, people don't know possibly that Mali is the size of Spain and France together. And so we are talking about enormous areas, and if you compare that with the problems of just covering a very short coastline in our own country, we complain about the fact that we have a long coastline, but there you have enormously more complex situations in terms of distance and security. So I was also struck, if we go back and say a word perhaps about the Middle Eastern report, which is very much inspired by your thinking and your experiences following closely the Turkey-Syria situation and so on. You argued in the beginning of this year that we should focus perhaps on a scenario looking at the situation in the Idlib region, which most people probably have no clue where it is, you know. And now when I look at that scenario which we have in the report, I look at the news today, it's actually happening. We have a lot of news on Idlib there, which is very worrying. You are listening to an e-learning light podcast produced by Lars-Erik Lundin for Lundin och Bäcklund AB. Copyright on and around the topic of Europe and security. Please do subscribe on the Lars-Erik Lundin channels on SoundCloud or YouTube. Thank you. Also, do visit the ellilundin.org website and follow on @Lundin on Twitter.